Welcome to the podcast. I'm Angela Bobier, and this is Life in the Talbot Settlement, brought to you by Tyrconnell Heritage Society and Backus-Page House Museum. In this series, we will do our best to give you a full appreciation of the history of Western Elgin County in southwestern Ontario, from First Nations through the original European settlers to the 1950s. I'll cover one topic per episode, with the first 8 setting the tone for who we are, where we are, and what we do here at Backus-Page House Museum. Please follow us on all social media by searching at Backus-Page House, spelt BACKUSPAGEHOUSE. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. From The Pioneer Farmer and Backwoodsman, Volume 2, by Edwin C. Gillette. We have no landlord to come at Michaelmas to say, "I want my rent." No poor rates to pay. We are in a free country. It is a pretty thing to stand at one's own door and see 100 acres of land of his own. That was a letter of Robert Slade, September 1835. Today I'll be chatting about the first steps settlers would have had to take when arriving in the Talbot settlement and what the settlers' duties were to get their land deed. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage and Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. In 1803, the year Talbot arrived, he had significant difficulty convincing people to settle, as the land was still undeveloped. Throughout 1804 and 1805, carpenters were busy building a house and barn. Then grist mills for grinding wheat into flour and sawmills for creating lumber for building were constructed on Talbot Creek to improve the living conditions. These employees and their families formed a very small community. In 1809, possibly attracted by these new additions, people began to move into the Talbot settlement. Colonel Talbot wanted settlers to populate his land, but that didn't mean he would accept just anybody. Colonel Talbot could reject any settler's land request, and did so to those who he deemed to be insufficiently respectful or whose beliefs conflicted with his own. Imagine that you were an English, Irish, or Scottish person looking to make a new life in Upper Canada in the late 18th or early 19th centuries. For starters, you couldn't just take a plane. You would have to spend at least 6 weeks on a cramped, uncomfortable sailing ship. At worst, trips across the Atlantic Ocean could take up to 14 weeks if sailing conditions were poor. You were required to bring all your own food to feed yourself and your family for the entire trip. The only things the passage fee covered was your spot on the ship and water to drink. You packed up your entire life and everything you would need to start out upon your arrival. For example, clothing, tools, cooking and eating utensils, sewing or mending kit, a Bible, and sentimental items if there was room. All this assuming you owned such things already. You most likely landed in Nova Scotia, then traveled up the St. Lawrence River to Quebec City. You may have then traveled to Montreal by steamship, then on to Kingston by bateau and cart. Another boat took you across Lake Ontario to Queenston, then carts carried you to Fort Erie. From there you would travel by schooner across Lake Erie to Port Talbot to meet with Colonel Thomas Talbot. All this traveling after Nova Scotia could add another 4 weeks onto your journey. Some people living in the United States heard about the land in Upper Canada, so they would walk or take smaller boats around the edges of Lake Erie to Port Talbot. Sailing directly across Lake Erie could be dangerous because of storms. Once you got to Port Talbot, you would have to ask Colonel Talbot for permission to settle on the tract of land he was administering. Then your work really began, because you have just moved to a very dense forest on the shores of Lake Erie. In southwestern Ontario, between 1802 and 1837, approximately 1/2 million acres were entrusted to the control of Thomas Talbot. Talbot was a successful and remarkable settlement promoter. Large portions of the so-called Talbot Tract remained unimproved by 1837, when the Talbot Agency was transferred to the Crown. By this date, however, Talbot had managed to settle approximately 6,000 families in the present-day counties of Norfolk, Elgin, Middlesex, Kent, and Essex. Talbot penciled in the settlers' names on his maps. Often, this information was subsequently erased or scratched out and replaced with the names of new residents. Often a date, probably the date of location, appears next to the settler's name. Although settlers received their land patents from the Crown, Talbot reportedly exercised control over them and could deny final deeds and patents if he so chose. In order to permanently secure the land patent, certain settler duties had to be met. These duties included, within 3 years, build a house of dimensions at least 16 feet by 20 feet and occupy it. Clear a road allowance across the front of your lot. Clear and fence 5 acres planted in crops. Cut large trees up to 1 chain length, which is 66 feet, from the road. A wood shanty or a log cabin could not be built by just one person, requiring the other settlers in the area to gather from miles around to assist in its construction. For the very first families, we assume they relied on all family members and perhaps Talbot's employees for assistance. Building corners from the rough-hewn logs was especially difficult, a well-cut corner being a source of pride for many local carpenters. A barn would also have to be built before a settler could begin farming in earnest, a more difficult undertaking than the log cabin, but one the community was willing to undertake, as local barns would also serve as meeting places for the whole settlement. The pioneers' reliance on others built an incredibly strong sense of community among the early Talbot settlers, further strengthened by their involvement with education. After building shelter and a barn, early farmers would have had to clear some land in order to plant crops, the most common of which at the time was wheat. In Ontario, where fields were covered in tree stumps and rocks, farmers couldn't plow their land like we see prairie settlers do. Farmers would have had to rake the entire field by hand or get their work animals to pull the cut-off top of a fallen tree, that they called a rough drag, over the soil. Either way, the difficult terrain made even the most basic farming extremely uninviting. Removing stumps from a field was no easy task either. The roots of the felled tree would eventually rot away, but farmers would expect to wait around 7 years before the stump could be removed. Basically, you farmed around tree stumps for years and years. You also walked, rode, and steered wagons around tree stumps. After 1817, the Talbot Road was extended and considered the best in all of Upper Canada. 2 main branches for stagecoaches were the London to St. Thomas, Port Stanley and Port Talbot, and the second from Fort Erie to Sandwich and on to Sarnia. The first stages began operating in the 1820s, but were seldom better than an open wagon or sleigh. These are not the stagecoaches you see in movie westerns. It was necessary to have a good road, and the settlement duties included clearing 10 acres of land and 1/2 the road itself in front of each lot, as well as 100 feet adjoining the road. It was also necessary that the Talbot Road should have no large blocks to obstruct settlement, and the Crown and clergy reserves were accordingly shifted to the back concessions. The settlers were in most cases poor and unable to pay survey and patent fees. Therefore, they should not be molested by the Toronto officials until it was entirely convenient to pay them. And lastly, no certificates for patent should issue except to persons who had erected a house 16 by 20 and been actual settlers for 5 years. This prevented them from selling out to speculators and induced continuous improvements. Situated between the lake and the ridge which forms its watershed, it was within convenient reach of excellent gravel on both sides. This natural advantage and the colonel's policy combined to make it an excellent highway. And it became a lesson to the settlers on the back concessions who vied with each other in improving their roads. The result is seen in the excellent highways which form a network over the county of Elgin. In 1837, Mrs. Anna Jameson visited Colonel Thomas Talbot and described the Talbot Road as the finest in the province. Anna Jameson went from Port Talbot to Chatham in a farmer's cart pulled by 2 horses. The bottom of the wagon had clean straw, and both her seat and the driver's made from slung straps. The driver was a respectable settler, a Mr. Bobier, from the neighborhood who charged $12 for the 2-day journey. Corduroy log roads made travel bumpy and uncomfortable. Water and mud were issues, and many a traveler had to assist drivers in getting their coach moving out of the holes. On bad roads, you could travel just over 2 miles an hour. Coaches would stop at inns to change horses, passengers to disembark or get on, and to get refreshments. By 1842, a daily line of stages operated across the province, mostly due to mail delivery. In the early 1850s, there was a complete trunk line from Quebec to Detroit, intersected by many branches. Stagecoach proprietors had long-term contracts with no competition in their area. The covered coaches kept in the vicinity of the larger towns, where the roads were better, and where it was worth an effort to take in the unwary. 6 people could sit inside, 3 to a bench, and another up front with the driver. Baggage would be located at the back and light baggage on the roof, similar to what you see in Western movies. 30 to 75 miles a day was the usual speed, with long delays and inconveniences. By the 1870s, stagecoaches were being replaced by the railroads. Now let's talk about settlers and their education. The settlers soon recognized that education was necessary if the Talbot settlement was to become a successful and self-sufficient community. This being said, education was much more limited than it is today, with the focus being only on teaching the 3 R's. Different subsections of the Talbot settlement had different teachers, but generally school curriculum was taught in a prominent settler's house and featured very strict punishments for misbehavior. In the future, we will do more podcast episodes about education in the Talbot settlement. All these challenging tasks we've talked about today are just some of the many ways Talbot settlers had to prepare their land for permanent residence. For more information, feel free to check out our book, The Pioneer Days in Aldeburgh, that can be purchased online at www.backus-pagehouse.ca. The acquisition of land in the Talbot settlement was the least of the early settlers' worries during the early 19th century. Building proper housing, clearing land for farming, and building roads were all obstacles settlers had to overcome before establishing the settlement we have come to know and love. Catch our next episode when I go in depth on the 4 Irish families that founded the community known as Little Ireland, located on Lakeview Line between Port Talbot and Tyrconnell. Please share the podcast with your friends and follow us on all social media platforms at Backus-Page House. The Backus-Page House Museum and Tyrconnell Heritage Society acknowledges the land we are on today as the traditional territory of First Nations people, the Attawandaron, and the Iroquois. As settlers at a settler-focused museum, we value both the significant historical and contemporary contributions of all original peoples and ask how we can be supportive in Indigenous cultural renewal. Life in the Talbot Settlement is a production of Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum, funded by the Department of Canadian Heritage. Your host has been Angela Bobier. Music provided by Jack Witmer. Thanks to our producer, Katlyn Reintsma. To make a charitable donation and to contact the Backus-Page House Museum, visit our website, www.backuspagehouse.ca. And thank you for listening.